Member for McIntyre.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President, and I rise to place on the record my support for the honourable member's motion, and particularly thank him for bringing this forward today. This is something that obviously has, as the honourable member for Launceston indicated, has been raised with many members of Parliament over many years. And Mr. President, when I saw this motion, my mind went back to a constituent of mine, and we all received a letter back in 2014 from Beverly Rubenak and her family, Beverly and Peter, for their son Tim, who lived at St Mary's. And they shared their story about Tim's condition and his challenges in living he was having epileptic seizures as a result of a brain injury, and he had been prescribed a range of anticonvulsant medications, and he was around 28 years of age. I will say, Mr. President, that sadly Tim passed away on the 22nd of May 2018. And so he had to access his medicinal cannabis through friends who provided that substance to him that supported his family to be able to cope with Tim to stay at home. Tim stayed at home and his family cared for him right through until 2018, May 2018. And the Rubenak family have been very proactive in their support for medicinal cannabis to be made available to those people who need it under circumstances that has been spoken of quite eloquently around this chamber so far on this notice of motion. But they also made representation through the end of life choices, and they attended the St Helens seminar. The honourable member for Mersey will remember Mr and Mrs Rubenak being there and sharing their support and indicating their support for that at that time, given what Tim had experienced in his life. So I pulled out the letter, and I won't go over it in any fullness, just to again thank the Rubenak family for continuing to support others in the community and share their story of Tim's challenges in not being able to access legally medicinal cannabis in his time of need. And that, Mr. President, was the momentum for me to support that at that time, but also to continue to support this approach today. And members will note that in question time I received some answers because I had recently had representation, Mr. President, from a constituent of mine who is accessing medicinal cannabis through a doctor in Sydney, and the medication is dispensed through a pharmacy in Melbourne and then sent through to this particular person in Tasmania. I mean, this is not the approach we need, Mr. President. And again, by interjection, when the honourable member for Windermere was presenting his contribution to his notice of motion, I said, we need a consistent and controlled approach here. That's what we need. And the honourable member for Murchison talked about the fact that you don't know what level of the that you have when you're buying it or sourcing it from wherever. And I mean, by interjection again, said, you know, it might depend on how much watering a crop has had or the conditions of the season, all of those things. We should be able to source that medication in a consistent way. You should not have to be finding your source, and as the Rubinex said, through the generosity of friends and acquaintances, we were able to acquire a sample of cold processed THC, has not been activated, medicinal cannabis oil for Tim to try. The Rubinex shouldn't have had to do that for their son Tim. My constituent, Mr. President, should not have to, through somebody in Sydney, and then have the medication dispensed in Victoria and have it sent over here. That shouldn't be happening for our constituents. There should be that consistent approach. And again, I support everything that's been said by the previous speakers, with some exception to the Honourable Leader, who didn't support the motion on behalf of her government, and that's their right.
That's why this motion's before us, though, isn't it?
That's right. That's right, because it's the policy. It's the policy. And I note in the response to my questions and the answers that were provided, and some of what the Honourable Leader has just read out was in the contents of the answers, and I thank the Honourable Leader for providing me quickly with a copy of that, because you can't take it all in when you're listening. But it said, you know, it is important to note the Tasmanian government is the only government in Australia to subsidise the cost of highly expensive, unregistered medicinal cannabis products and make their potential benefits accessible to all Tasmanians, not just those who can afford to pay. Well, we just note with the numbers that there's only 17. There's only 17 people accessing it, 39 applications, and only 17 accessing. So what are those other 22 people doing? And plus all the other people that are in our communities who are doing exactly like the Cleavers and using friends and acquaintances if need be, or growing it themselves.
Through you, Mr. President, the reason that there was a remainder was that they hadn't exhausted all conventional use, whatever it is, medicines for their condition at that stage.
And I acknowledge that that's the government's position, but I recall the Honourable Member for Murchison talking about the aspect of the fact that some of those traditional medications actually are worse than what the person is dealing with. They have more side effects, negative side effects to what they're dealing with. I mean, nobody is going to go through the CAS process if they haven't at least gone through the process with their GP. And it's only in the last few weeks, Mr. President, we have put so much faith in the medical fraternity, in our doctors, when we discuss the end-of-life choices, voluntary assisted dying, and the role that doctors play in the lives of their patients. We've talked about that. Why wouldn't they know and have that understanding of whether their patient is going to receive the relief that they need from traditional medicine, or in this case accessing medicinal cannabis? They would know that. They would absolutely know that, because we trust those doctors who look after their patients to know that, have that level of understanding. So it's certainly, I believe that if we're going to trust them in that way, that we should at least be in line. Now, I know I'm not always a supporter of a national consistent approach, but in this case, I would have to say that when you hear, and I thank the Honourable Member for Windermere for going through the different states and outlining which ones have the right process in place. Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, WA and ACT. And Northern Territory doing things a little differently, and here's Tasmania lagging at the bottom of the pack. So my particular constituent, Mr. President, because the questions I asked were around PTSD, certainly not the epilepsy path, but still, this particular person is able to have a more normal and functioning life because of the access to medicinal cannabis. That again, as I said, doctor in Sydney, pharmacist in Victoria. That was the basis of my questions. I don't believe that I've got enough answers to go back to my constituent at this point in time, but I believe that as a House of Parliament representing our community, that this is a really useful process and vehicle to continue to push the government to look at their policy. And I know the Honourable Leader will make sure that the Minister and her government take on board the contributions made by honourable members, because we are representing our communities. I mean, I absolutely don't support the use of drugs in any way, shape or form other than for medicinal purposes. And that's what we're asking for here. We are asking for access for medicinal purposes. And the reason why the government I would suggest, has been so generous in subsidising, the only government in Australia to subsidise the cost of highly expensive unregistered medicinal cannabis products, make their potential benefits accessible to all Tasmanians, not just those who can afford to pay, is because we hardly have any. And I believe that if there was a contribution needed, there is a lot of people in the community who would be standing at their driveways hoping, not standing at their driveways, but at their properties, hoping that they don't see a police officer coming up their driveway and feeling very anxious. They would much rather, I would suggest, pay some level of money, whether it be subsidised to the level that the government has been so generous thus far, or whether it be at perhaps a higher level. And I expect that there would be family who would be willing to support their family member in these circumstances, rather than have their loved ones feeling anxious every time they see a police officer in and around their neighbourhood, wondering if somebody has dobbed them in or somebody has suggested that their particular loved one may well be illegally using medicinal cannabis for medicinal purposes. So, Mr. President, I don't think I need to make too many more points about this. I think it's very obvious that there is support in our communities, from what I'm hearing, very much so, for the use and for the access to and the use of medicinal cannabis, where a GP has made a decision that their patient meets the criteria.
In Tasmania's case, a specialist.
I mean, we talked about access to specialists for weeks ago, for the last however many weeks.
I've been 2 years, but I've been trying to access a specialist now for about 3 months.
And who knows their patients best, Mr President? Their GP. Who knows their patients best? A GP. It shouldn't need a referral to an appropriate specialist. We talked about the value of a GP, your own local doctor or your doctor, whether they be local or whether they be a locum or whatever they be. If they're your GP and they know you and you meet the requirements and you've done what you can through traditional medication and it is not working for you, then you should be able to access medicinal cannabis, in my view. Again, I congratulate the compassionate former copper on his devotion to this, and certainly representing the Cleaver family in this regard. And I again thank the Rubinek family who have continued to advocate for those in our community so that they don't have to live through what the Rubineks had to while their son Tim was on this earth. And I think in respect for the Rubinek family, I need to support this and I will continue to support this particular avenue that the Honourable Member is seeking the government to support. So we won't give up on this. We won't give up on this.